He walked in looking poor, but left everyone richer in lessons they'd never forget. Elias Carter stood quietly at the threshold of the restaurant, his figure almost blending with the midday sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows. At first glance, he looked like just another weary man in his late 50s, his hair peppered with grey, his shirt faded from too many washes, and his trousers carrying the soft wrinkles of long wear. In his hand, he clutched an old brown leather wallet, worn at the edges, as though it had survived a lifetime of opening and closing. There was nothing about him that suggested he belonged in a place like this, an upscale restaurant with polished floors, gleaming cutlery and a subtle scent of roasted herbs floating in the air. Outside, the faint hum of city traffic carried on with its usual rhythm, muffled by the insulated glass. Inside, however, everything seemed staged, chairs aligned perfectly, golden chandeliers scattering light like fine jewelry, and the soft murmur of well-dressed guests discussing things that seemed just as polished as their appearance. Elias cleared his throat gently and stepped forward. His voice, calm and polite, carried none of the hesitation that the rest of him suggested. "Excuse me," he said to the waiter closest to him. "Would there be a table available?" The young waiter, in his crisp uniform, turned with automatic courtesy, but his eyes, scanning Elias from head to toe, faltered. For a moment his practiced smile broke. The waiter's gaze lingered on the frayed cuff of Elias's sleeve, the scuffed leather of his shoes, and then flicked quickly back to the old wallet in his hand. He hesitated, as though calculating the likelihood of this man affording even the simplest dish on the menu. Just a moment, sir," the waiter stammered, his tone caught between duty and doubt. Then, almost too quickly, he gestured toward the far side of the room. "You'll need to speak with the manager." The words weren't hostile, yet the pause before them carried a message loud enough to be heard by anyone listening. "You don't quite fit here." Elias nodded slowly, offering a gentle smile that didn't seem to waver. He didn't protest, didn't argue, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he remained by the doorway for a moment longer, his eyes sweeping across the restaurant as though he was reacquainting himself with an old memory. The polished mahogany tables, the elegant arch of the staircase, even the abstract painting that hung proudly on the far wall. His gaze lingered on each of these details, not with curiosity, but with a familiarity too subtle to miss. It was the way one looks at a home they haven't entered in years, a place both known and forgotten. A subtle shift of his lips hinted at something unspoken, a secret sitting quietly beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. To the others in the room, he was merely a poor man standing awkwardly at the edge of luxury. But to Elias, the polished interior was more than just decoration. It was a mirror of something he had once touched, perhaps even built, long before anyone here thought to question whether he belonged. The sound of polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as the restaurant's manager made his way toward Elias. His smile was the kind that had been practiced in mirrors, a curve of the lips without warmth, a gesture rehearsed for customers who carried gold cards and expensive watches. For Elias, though, that smile didn't last. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager began smoothly, hands clasped in front of him. "How may I help you today?" Elias adjusted the old wallet in his hand and met the man's gaze with calm politeness. "I'd like to try the chef's special meal, if you please." It was a simple request, spoken with quiet dignity. But the manager's expression faltered almost instantly. The smile that had been so carefully arranged slipped, leaving behind a look that was equal parts disbelief and disdain. His eyes flicked once more to Elias's faded shirt, the softened leather of his shoes, and that tired wallet clutched like a relic. "Ah," the manager said after a heavy pause, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sir, this isn't really the kind of place for casual visitors. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." The words were delivered with the softness of silk, but the sting was sharp enough to draw blood. Around them, a few diners shifted in their seats, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. A couple in the corner leaned closer to each other, whispering behind manicured hands. Elias did not flinch. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, as though he had weathered storms far heavier than the weight of one man's prejudice. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the suggestion, then spoke again in the same even tone. "I'd pay double," he said almost gently, "if I still had money." The phrase hung in the air like a puzzle no one cared to solve. To most ears, it sounded absurd, an admission of lack dressed up in impossible promise. A chuckle escaped from one of the waiters nearby, who quickly looked away, pretending to straighten silverware on a table. Another staff member smirked openly, glancing at the manager for permission to laugh. Permission was granted a heartbeat later. The manager barked a laugh, loud and unrestrained. He shook his head, as though Elias had just delivered the punchline to a poor man's joke. "Double?" he repeated, grinning cruelly. "You can't even afford one plate." Laughter rippled softly among the staff, like the echo of a cruel choir. A few diners, catching fragments of the exchange, turned their heads to see the man at the center of this sudden entertainment. Some smirked, some whispered, others only stared. Elias stood still in the middle of it all, the sunlight from the windows casting him in warm gold. The brightness revealed every crease in his shirt, every wrinkle at the corners of his eyes, the quiet exhaustion etched into his posture. Yet there was no shame in his face, no anger, no fire rising to meet the insult. The humiliation thickened in the air like smoke, suffocating and heavy. But Elias seemed to breathe easily. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not plead for understanding. Instead, he nodded slowly, the kind of nod that felt less like submission and more like acknowledgement of a truth others were too blind to see. The manager, emboldened by Elias's silence, leaned slightly closer. His voice dropped, quieter now, but the venom was the same. "People like you," he murmured, "don't belong here. This isn't a charity. Go find a diner or a street stall. You'll be happier there." The words slid into Elias's ears like shards of ice. Yet still he remained unmoved. His hand tightened slightly around the wallet, the leather groaning faintly under his grip. But his eyes never wavered. They carried something strange, something serene, almost pitying. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire room seemed suspended between cruelty and curiosity, waiting for the poor man to break, to shout, to protest, to leave in embarrassment. But Elias did none of those things. Instead, he let the manager's words hang unanswered. The only sound was the soft clatter of cutlery from a distant table and the muted hum of traffic beyond the glass. He lowered his gaze, not out of defeat, but out of choice, as though he had already weighed the worth of arguing and found it empty. The camera would have lingered here, on Elias's face, calm and unreadable, framed by the harsh laughter and whispering shadows around him. His stillness made him an enigma. To the onlookers, he was a man too poor to matter, too proud to fight back. To himself, he was something else entirely. Slowly, he exhaled, the corners of his lips curling into the faintest ghost of a smile, one that none of them understood. And in that smile lay the first unspoken clue. Elias Carter was not what he seemed. Elias moved away from the counter with the same quiet grace that had marked his entrance. Without complaint, he took a seat at the far edge of the lobby, where the polished marble met the shadow of the wall. The chair beneath him gleamed with varnish, its surface smooth and unyielding. He sat with his back straight, the old wallet resting in his lap like a trusted companion. Around him, life in the restaurant carried on with unbroken rhythm. Waiters hurried past with trays of sizzling food, the air filled with the fragrance of rosemary, garlic, and freshly seared meat. Each plate was a performance, each delivery to a table a ceremony of wealth and exclusivity. Yet not a single glance fell on Elias, sitting there in clothes that had long outlived fashion. He was invisible, swallowed by the opulence that buzzed around him, but Elias was not idle. His eyes, calm and observant, wandered across the space. He lingered on a painting mounted proudly on the wall, a striking abstract of bold strokes and hidden geometry. The colors were rich but carefully chosen, a blend of chaos and precision. At the bottom corner, almost hidden from careless eyes, was a small signature, E. Carter. No one else noticed. Guests passed it by as nothing more than decoration, a splash of sophistication to justify the price of their meals. Yet Elias's gaze softened, touched by the familiarity of it, as if he were greeting an old friend. He allowed himself a faint smile, one that flickered briefly before fading back into the calm mask he wore. His hand drifted down to the table beside him. Fingers roughened by time traced the grain of the wood, following the carved edges. He tapped it once, twice, with quiet recognition. The design was distinct, marked by a craftsman's habit, his craftsman's habit. He remembered the man who had shaped these very tables, a carpenter Elias had once employed. He could almost hear the rhythmic beat of hammer against nail, smell the sawdust that had clung to the air in the workshop. These tables carried more than food. They carried the memory of hands that worked under his roof. The hints of familiarity gathered like shadows creeping across the floor. Elias was not a stranger here, no matter what the laughter of the staff suggested. The doors to the restaurant swung open then, letting in a burst of midday light and a man in a delivery uniform. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his arms burdened with boxes of fresh produce. The moment his eyes landed on Elias, they lit with recognition. "Mr. C!" he exclaimed warmly, his voice echoing a little too loudly across the polished space. "Didn't expect to see you here, sir." The word "sir" hung in the air, heavier than the smell of food, heavier than the chandeliers above. Heads turned. The delivery man's smile was genuine, deferential even. Before Elias could respond, the manager was already striding forward, his polished shoes sharp against the floor. He shot the delivery man a sharp glare, a silent warning to silence himself. "That's enough," he hissed under his breath. "Get back to work." The delivery man's smile faltered, his eyes darting between Elias and the manager. He muttered an apology, bowing his head slightly toward Elias before slipping quickly toward the kitchen with his boxes. The door swung shut behind him, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence that stretched longer than anyone cared to admit. The manager turned back, his expression caught between suspicion and annoyance. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Elias again, this time not just as a nuisance, but as a puzzle. "Do you know him?" the manager asked, his tone sharp, almost accusing. Elias's eyes glimmered faintly, not with offense, but with quiet amusement. He lifted his head, meeting the manager's gaze with a look that was unreadable yet steady. His lips curved into the smallest smile, a secret folded carefully in the corner of his mouth. "He used to work for me," Elias said softly. The words were simple, unadorned, but they struck the air with unexpected weight. A few diners who overheard shifted uncomfortably, their forks pausing mid-air. A waiter passing by slowed his step, caught by curiosity. The manager scoffed, his laugh more forced this time, but the sound lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. He waved a dismissive hand as though swatting away a fly. "For you? I doubt it." Elias did not argue. He only leaned back against the chair, his fingers resting on the worn leather of his wallet. His calmness was unnerving, his silence louder than any defense he could have spoken. Whispers trickled through the room now, little fragments. "Who is he? Did you hear what he said?" "Mr. C, what does that mean?" Suspicion, curiosity, and unease mingled together like smoke curling in the air. The restaurant, once a stage for mockery, was slowly shifting into something else. The laughter had thinned. The staff who had chuckled earlier now avoided looking directly at Elias, uncertain of the truth. The diners who had smirked now stared, trying to piece together the threads of this mystery, and there he sat, at the edge of the lobby, quiet as ever. Elias Carter, the man who looked like a stranger, was suddenly someone no one could place. He was a riddle seated among them, and with every passing second, the answer seemed further from reach. The suspense grew, not in what Elias said, but in what he withheld. Every subtle smile, every lingering glance at the decor, every familiar trace of recognition deepened the question: who exactly was this man? The afternoon light shifted as the restaurant doors swung open once again. A young couple entered, their hands interlaced, the woman's laughter ringing like a silver bell. They hesitated at the entrance, glancing around the crowded dining room with expectant eyes. The manager, ever eager for profitable customers, straightened immediately. His posture sharpened, his smile returning in full rehearsed brilliance. With the energy of a man suddenly promoted, he strode toward them, nearly brushing past Elias without a flicker of acknowledgement. "Good afternoon," the manager announced with exaggerated charm. "Welcome to our establishment. Please, this way." The couple followed, relieved as he fussed over them, gesturing toward a freshly cleared table near the window. The sunlight caught the rim of their glasses, making their drinks sparkle. Laughter spilled between them as the waiter hurried to bring menus. And there, only a few feet away, Elias remained where he was, quiet, unacknowledged, a ghost at the edges of a world he had once built. He didn't stir, didn't interrupt. His gaze rested on the couple briefly, then drifted back to the painting on the wall. But the atmosphere shifted again. The door opened a second time, its brass handle gleaming as a gust of warm air followed. This time it wasn't a guest. An elegant woman stepped in, poised, commanding, her presence slicing through the restaurant's chatter like a knife. She was dressed in tailored silk, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, carried the weight of someone who owned not just property, but respect. She held a small ring of keys in her hand, still warm from the car she had just parked. The staff straightened instinctively, a wave of alertness running through them. This was not a customer. This was authority. The owner. The hum of conversation lowered, curiosity rippling as eyes followed her progress across the room. She moved with purpose until suddenly her stride faltered. Her gaze had landed on the man seated in the shadows, Elias. The keys in her hand slipped, clattering against the floor in a cascade of metal. For a moment she seemed not to hear them, her face drained of its polished composure, her lips parting in shock. "Elias?" Her voice trembled, a whisper that cracked open the air. What are you doing here like this?" The room froze. Knives paused mid-slice. Glasses hovered just shy of lips. The couple who had just sat down turned their heads, curiosity overtaking their private joy. The waiters stiffened, trays heavy in their hands. Silence descended like a blanket smothering the noise. Elias did not move immediately. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers with calm recognition, as if the years between them had folded in a single blink. He offered no explanation, no apology, only a faint nod, as though this meeting had been inevitable. The manager blinked, confusion etched deep into his features. He glanced between Elias, seated in his worn clothes, and the woman whose presence commanded deference. His mouth opened, words fumbling for purchase. You know him?" he asked, incredulous. His tone caught somewhere between disbelief and disdain. The owner inhaled sharply as if steadying herself, then turned fully to face the room. Her eyes glistened, though she fought to hold her composure. When she spoke, her voice carried, trembling yet resolute, filling every corner of the restaurant. "Know him?" She almost laughed, but the sound was raw, broken. This man is the reason any of you are standing here today. Without him, none of this would exist." A gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp and collective. Forks clinked softly against plates. A woman at the corner table covered her mouth with her hand. The couple near the window leaned closer, their smiles replaced with awe. The manager paled. His eyes darted back to Elias, the old wallet, the quiet dignity, the calm that now seemed unbearably heavy with meaning. His own mocking words echoed in his ears like ghosts. You can't even afford one plate." Shame crawled up his neck, hot and suffocating. The laughter from earlier, the chuckles, the sneers, the whispered judgments, all of it evaporated in the silence that followed. What remained was only the sound of hearts pounding, of truths rearranging themselves in the minds of every witness. Elias did not bask in the revelation. He did not gloat or smirk or demand recognition. He simply lowered his gaze again, as if the weight of memory was enough. His calm had not changed. It was the room that shifted around him, bending to the truth of who he was. The owner stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble, her breath uneven. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, as though touching him might prove he was real. "Elias," she whispered again, her voice softening. "You built this. You gave me everything. And here you sit, treated like nothing." Her voice cracked, and she turned her head sharply, eyes flashing toward the manager. The unspoken accusation was louder than any shout. The manager's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain. But words failed him, collapsing beneath the weight of the truth, now exposed. In that moment, the hierarchy of the room reversed. Elias, the man once invisible, became the center of gravity, and everyone else, guests, staff, even the manager, orbited in stunned silence, their laughter swallowed whole by shame. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until the manager's voice cracked through it. His confidence, so sharp, so smug only moments ago, was gone. In its place was a trembling stammer, words tripping over themselves as his face drained of color. I didn't know," he gasped, his throat dry, eyes wide as if he had just seen a ghost. His hands fidgeted, one grasping the other in a nervous twist. "I swear, sir, I had no idea who you were. Please forgive me." But Elias raised a hand ever so slightly, and the manager fell silent. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was calm, almost weary, yet it carried more weight than any outburst could have. Elias's eyes, steady and unwavering, locked onto the man who had laughed at him only minutes earlier. "You never asked," Elias said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. The words cut deeper than any shout. "You only saw what you wanted to see." The sentence hung in the air, heavy, impossible to ignore. Some diners lowered their eyes, as if ashamed of their own complicity in the laughter. Others stared at Elias, their faces etched with regret, realizing the mirror his words held up was large enough to reflect them all. The manager opened his mouth again, but no words came. His lips moved, forming fragments. "Sorry, didn't mean mistake." But none could break through the weight of Elias's truth. He stood there, sweating beneath the polished chandeliers, suddenly small in the very place he thought he ruled. The owner, her breath unsteady, stepped forward. She searched Elias's face as though looking for a trace of the man she once knew, the benefactor who had turned her dream into reality. Her voice softened, trembling with sincerity. "Elias," she whispered, then steadied herself. "Please, let us prepare your favorite dish. On the house, it would mean everything to me." A murmur swept through the room. It was not an offer extended to a guest. It was a plea, an attempt at redemption, a recognition that Elias was not just a man, but the foundation on which this entire place was built. For a moment Elias seemed to consider it. His gaze drifted toward the kitchen, where the smell of roasted garlic and seared herbs wafted through the air. Memories flickered across his face, faint but unmistakable, the nights of planning, the dreams invested, the hope stitched into every detail of this establishment. But then his eyes returned to the woman, kind yet resolute. He shook his head gently. "No," he said softly. "Not today." The refusal was not harsh. It was polite, almost graceful, but it carried the weight of finality. Elias stood taller, his shoulders straightening, his voice steady. He needed no reward, no free dish, no token of recognition. His dignity was his meal, his truth, his sustenance. The owner blinked rapidly, emotion shimmering at the edges of her eyes. She nodded once, deeply, as if acknowledging a verdict she could not appeal. A hush settled across the restaurant. Even the clinking of silverware ceased. All eyes followed Elias as he placed the worn leather wallet back into his jacket pocket. Slowly he pushed himself to his feet. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. The camera would linger here. First, on Elias's shoes, scuffed leather, worn from years of walking roads few in this room would ever step on. Shoes that bore the weight of ridicule yet never faltered. Then the lens would rise, sweeping across the restaurant's gleaming surfaces, the polished tables, the crystal glasses, the golden accents adorning the walls. Everything pristine, expensive, dripping with opulence. The contrast was brutal. Worn leather against gilded luxury. A man overlooked, standing in the middle of a monument he helped build. Elias's gaze swept across the room one final time. He did not look at the manager again, nor at the guests whose whispers had cut like knives. His eyes paused only briefly on the painting, the one signed with his own initials, hanging in plain sight, yet unnoticed by all. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Without another word, he turned toward the door. Each step was measured, deliberate. His quiet exit echoed louder than any storm. The guests remained frozen, their breath held, their shame palpable. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter from earlier, now a memory they wished desperately to erase. The manager stood rooted to the floor, pale and trembling, unable to chase the man he had dismissed. His apology had come too late, and Elias's calm rebuke would haunt him far longer than a shouted curse ever could. As Elias reached the door, the sunlight from outside spilled across him, casting his silhouette in gold. For a heartbeat, he looked larger than life, not just a man in worn clothes, but a figure who carried his own light. And then, without fanfare, he was gone. The restaurant exhaled at once, as though the air itself had been holding its breath. But in the space he left behind there was no relief, only the echo of his words, looping endlessly in the silence. You never asked. You only saw what you wanted to see. The door closed softly behind him, its polished glass catching the last glimpse of his silhouette. Elias stepped into the open air, where the midday sun poured down like liquid gold. The city hummed beyond the restaurant's walls, horns honking in the distance, footsteps scattering across sidewalks, voices weaving into the fabric of an ordinary afternoon. Yet for those still inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Behind him, silence lingered, thick, heavy, almost sacred, a silence that had nothing to do with the absence of noise and everything to do with the weight of realization. For the diners, for the waiters, for the manager, the world they thought they knew had just cracked open. Elias walked calmly, each step steady, unhurried. The sunlight caught on his worn shoes, scuffed leather that had carried him through places grand and humble alike. His shadow stretched long across the pavement, dark against the brightness, as if the earth itself bowed beneath him. Inside, the manager stood frozen. The arrogance that once fueled his laughter had drained from his face, leaving only pale regret. His head bowed, not from instruction but from shame. He could still hear Elias's words reverberating like thunder in his skull. You never asked. You only saw what you wanted to see. The diners, too, remained hushed. Some stared at their plates without appetite, their reflections staring back at them in the polished silver. Others cast furtive glances at the door, half expecting Elias to return, half hoping he would. No one spoke, because what words could possibly bridge the gulf between what they had assumed and what they had just witnessed? The owner stood with trembling hands, her keys still lying forgotten on the floor. She stared at the empty chair where Elias had sat, her heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for all he had given, guilt for not recognizing sooner the man who had given it, and Elias. He did not look back. His eyes were on the street ahead, where the sunlight painted everything in clarity. He did not need their recognition nor their apologies. He had carried their scorn with grace, their laughter with patience, their ignorance with calm. He was not defined by how others saw him. His life, his legacy, his worth, all of it stretched far beyond their shallow judgments. Perhaps the narrator's voice would rise here, soft but steady, weaving the truth into words for those willing to listen. True wealth isn't measured in the wallet. It isn't in the bills folded in leather or the numbers stamped on cards. True wealth is in legacy, what you've built, what you've given, the lives you've touched. And respect? Respect should never be a currency traded for appearances. It should be the foundation on which every human interaction stands, for arrogance blinds us. It makes us mock what we don't understand, dismiss what we cannot see, and belittle what stands quietly before us. But humility opens our eyes. It allows us to see not with judgment, but with clarity, to recognize worth in places we never thought to look, to realize that sometimes the man in worn shoes has walked farther than we ever will. Elias reached the corner of the street. A soft breeze lifted the edges of his shirt, carrying with it the scents of the city. Fresh bread from a nearby bakery, gasoline from the traffic, faint blossoms from a florist's stand down the block. The world moved as it always had, unaware that a lesson had just unfolded in the gilded cage of that restaurant. He paused for a moment, adjusting the old wallet in his pocket. It was not heavy, not with money, but with memory. He smiled faintly, almost to himself, then stepped forward again, his figure swallowed gradually by the light. Back inside, the manager finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. I didn't know," he whispered again, but now no one laughed. His words were not an excuse, only a confession of blindness. He lowered his head, shame pressing his shoulders downward. He realized too late that he had been entrusted with something precious, his own role, his own responsibility to see people as more than what they wore. And he had failed. The final image lingers here, Elias's shadow stretching long across the pavement, a reminder of a presence that could not be erased. And behind him, through the glass, the once arrogant manager bowed in silence, the weight of his own arrogance pressing him down. The moral was clear, sharp enough to etch itself into memory. Never judge someone by their appearance. Arrogance blinds us to the truth. Humility reveals it. And sometimes a single act of kindness, a moment of respect freely given, means more than all the riches in the world. For wealth fades, but dignity endures. And Elias Carter, with nothing but worn shoes and an old wallet, walked away richer than anyone else in that room.